Good morning, Europe. It's Wednesday, the 20th of June. Our top stories for you. Backing an ally. Macron pledges to take back migrants first registered in France if Germany refused them. This as they battle deep divisions in the EU. 1 every 2 seconds. That is the number of people forced to leave their homes in 2017, says a new UN report. And over in the Cube, our social media news desk.
As America's zero-tolerance policy breaks up immigration families at the border, we'll have the latest for you on the viral social fundraising campaign bringing them together.
And presidential etiquette. France's Macron schools a young man on how not to address a leader. Thank you for starting your day with us. Our top story, France dubbed it a moment of truth. In a picturesque setting just outside Berlin, the French and German leaders put on a display of friendship and unity as they held long-awaited talks on refugee policy, security and a Eurozone budget. Well, Paris has been pressing Berlin for months to reach an accord on crisis-proofing the EU. And now German Chancellor Angela Merkel says they are, quote, opening a new chapter. But details of exactly what was agreed remain vague. And we're joined live now by our correspondent in Berlin, Jessica Salt. Jessica, so Merkel was quoted as saying, our goal is to keep Europe from becoming divided. That sounds nice, but it is quite vague. Do we know if anything concrete came out of that?
Well, Tessa, yesterday's meeting is being interpreted in Germany as a very important signal of solidarity from French President Emmanuel Macron to Chancellor Angela Merkel on the issue of migration, the issue which is currently threatening to tear up her Conservative alliance here in Germany. Now, the two leaders stood side by side yesterday and outlined their plans for a European response to the migration crisis, including tackling the causes of migration, working with African countries to stop the illegal smuggling into Europe, increasing the border control of the EU external borders, and also, as Macron said, calling for unity and responsibility amongst EU countries when it comes to accepting and distributing asylum seekers. So Berlin and Paris seem to be eye to eye on the issue of migration, but of course they will have to convince EU leaders moving forward ahead of a summit at the end of next week. Emmanuel Macron also not going home empty-handed yesterday on his demands for EU reforms. Angela Merkel conceding to the idea of an EU budget, which we were told would be finalised by 2021. But still lots of questions around this. For example, how big is this budget going to be? So a lot more discussions needed on this particular issue, but still a very significant nod from the German Chancellor to Macron on his demands for EU reforms.
All right, thank you for that update. Jessica Saltz live there in Berlin. And for some analysis on the agreement that was just reached, journalist Stefan de Vries joins us now live from Paris. Stefan, let's talk about that Eurozone budget. We don't have details, but the fact that there is a budget, it is a big deal, right? And tell us why.
Well, it is a big deal, but if you look at it in the details, it's actually not a major breakthrough. Don't forget that this was one of Emmanuel Macron's major campaign promises last year. And if you read the document, it's actually quite modest. It's all very vague. And of course, that's intentional, because the most basic issue, where is the money going to come from for this so-called Eurozone budget? Well, this question is not answered. There are some proposals. They mentioned, for instance, using part of the existing EU budget. There could be a financial transaction tax. There could also be a tax for companies like Google, Amazon or Facebook. But most importantly, the devil is in the detail, because there's also mention of just 2 words, but I think they're very important: without transfers. Now, this is a technical term. I'm quite sure this is in it because the Germans insisted on these terms. It basically means that the European member states are not allowed to give money to other European member states to help them when they're in financial trouble. So it's actually not a real Eurozone budget. It's just a common basket of money that already exists. And then most importantly, yesterday's proposals are called the French-German roadmap. But let's not forget that at this very moment, the European Union counts 26 other member states, and many of them are fiercely opposed to a common European budget. Probably the most important resistant is Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister. He is leading a sort of revolt of Northern and Eastern European countries, sometimes nicknamed Mark Rutte and the Seven Dwarfs. But he is very important in the resistance against this Eurozone budget. So the two leaders will have a lot of work in the next couple of months, maybe even years, to convince the other partners. But most importantly, the two leaders can go back to their capitals today and say to their voters that the agreement is a breakthrough and that the summit was a success.
It's all about the domestic audience, isn't it? Thank you for that, Stéphane de Vries, a journalist there based in Paris. Now, a cesspool of political bias. Those are the words of the U.S. envoy to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, after announcing her country's withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council. She argues the body hasn't made key reforms. It includes countries with a poor human rights record and has a political bias against Israel. Euronews journalist Katie Dartford has more.
The world's most inhumane regimes continue to escape scrutiny. And the Council continues politicizing and scapegoating of countries with positive human rights records in an attempt to distract from the abusers in their ranks. Therefore, as we said we would do a year ago, if we did not see any progress, the United States is officially withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council.
The withdrawal is the latest departure by the Trump administration from an international institution after already having exited the Paris Climate Agreement and the Iran nuclear deal. The UN Human Rights Council is made up of 47 countries. Membership is based on equitable geographical distribution. The US is very critical of the membership, notably of China, Cuba and Venezuela, but also of the entry of the Democratic Republic of Congo last year.
The DRC is widely known to have one of the worst human rights records in the world. Even as it was being elected to membership in the Human Rights Council, mass graves continued to be discovered in the Congo. Such a council, in fact, damages the cause of human rights. And then, of course, there is the matter of the chronic bias against Israel. Earlier this year, as it has in previous years, the Human Rights Council passed 5 resolutions against Israel, more than the number passed against North Korea, Iran, and Syria combined.
Haley also said that the withdrawal is not a retreat from human rights commitments, but the US cannot, in her words, remain a part of a hypocritical and self-serving organisation that makes a mockery of human rights. Katie Dartford for Euronews.
Americans are raising their voices in protest against the Trump administration's zero-tolerance immigration policy. Well, that policy, in effect for weeks now, has ignited protests. It separates parents accused of crossing the border illegally from their children at the border with Mexico. Business groups have joined those protesting for an end to the forced separations, as Republican lawmakers in the House of Representatives are scrambling to decide on a new U.S. immigration bill. Well, a campaign to help reunite those families separated at the border has been launched online, and it's already breaking records. Alex and the Cube team have more on this. Alex.
With just the smallest amount of optimism, I suppose you could say. The hope to raise just a couple of €1,000 to try and help these people at the border. The campaign was started by this couple, as you can see here, with a young daughter themselves. Now, they were so moved by pictures we had shown you yesterday, but have been going around for a while in the United States, of families being separated at the border, that they were moved to do something about it. Their young daughter, they saw a similarity with this small crying toddler. This is the image we did show you yesterday in the Cube. This image went viral. She is here at the border, a young Honduran toddler. Her mother is being searched, and here she is, distraught at these scenes. Now, the couple who started the campaign felt the closest thing they could do to giving this young child a hug and help her was to do their best to launch a campaign. And it started off with modest aspirations, but now has broken records, it's being reported. This is the latest tally on the Facebook page. We can bring it to you here. It has now raised over $7.5 million, so far exceeding their initial hope. Now, where's all this money going, I suppose you could say? Yes, it's wonderful to have these intentions to help reunite the families. Where is the money going? Well, it's going to a Texas not-for-profit organisation which aims to reunite the families and help them post-bond to leave jail and then represent themselves legally, both to stay together and then to stay in the United States. Now, it's a deeply political issue, but this is a human face of it, and that campaign continues to go viral. Our team here in the Cube have been across this story since the campaign first popped up, and we'll be sure to bring you all the latest as it develops. Tessa.
And here again, we see the power of social media. Thank you for that, Alex and the Cube team. To Yemen now, where pro-government fighters have stormed the airport in the country's main port of Hodeidah. The Saudi-led coalition captured large areas of the compound in battles with Iran-aligned Houthis, dozens of whom are said to be dead or wounded. The alliance launched a major offensive to capture the rebel-held Red Sea city last week. Its port is the main passageway for food and aid supplies in a country where over 8 million people are at risk of famine. And still to come for you in Good Morning Europe, Hungary's on a collision course with Europe over a law that would jail people for helping migrants. We've got that analysis with our Brussels correspondent and over in the Cube.
Canada comes just the second country in the world to legalise cannabis. We'll have all the reaction for you. But first, let's look at your weather.
You're watching Good Morning Europe. Our top story this morning, German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron have been trying to thrash out an agreement on immigration, security and the EU budget. Merkel says they are, quote, opening a new chapter, but few details have emerged. Hungary is pushing ahead with a controversial bill that will criminalize any help given to undocumented migrants. Parliament is set to pass the so-called Stop Soros bill today without waiting for a legal opinion from human rights experts at the Council of Europe. That's due this Friday. Well, the new law will make it much harder, both legally and financially, for NGOs to do their work, and people who help migrants submit asylum requests could face jail time. It's part of the government's campaign against U.S. billionaire George Soros and the NGOs he supports, which Prime Minister Viktor Orban accuses of encouraging mass immigration. And as you can imagine, the bill is being closely watched across the EU. And I'm joined now by our correspondent Brian Carter in Brussels. Brian, what has the European reaction been to this move?
Well, Tessa, I made a few phone calls yesterday to get reactions, and they've been mostly critical. No reaction from the European Commission. They say they will wait until the vote is through before eventually commenting. And as you said, the Council of Europe said they were hoping for the Hungarian Parliament to wait until at least Friday, but it seems that the vote will go through today nevertheless. And that timing is criticized by some MEPs. One of them is Judith Sargentini, a Green MEP from the Netherlands, who told me that this law was seriously worrisome, that the rule of law was in serious danger, that it will hurt Hungarians as well because it will restrict their freedom of association. That feeling was echoed by another MEP from Hungary who said that actually this law had nothing to do with George Soros or migrants. It was just a way to sell to the public, I quote, a campaign of hate-mongering to attack independent voices in Hungary. From the Liberals and Democrats here in the European Parliament, their president Guy Verhofstadt told me that Fidesz should abandon their plan to curb the healthy functioning of civil society. Fidesz is the party of Viktor Orban, a member of the European People's Party, and that criticism was echoed by a member of the Socialist group who said, I quote, that this disgusting campaign is against European values and the EPP should no longer tolerate this behavior in its ranks. Tessa?
Indeed, the European People's Party, the EPP, they're the biggest party there at the European Parliament, and Fidesz is a member of that. What are they saying about this?
Well, of course, they were less critical of the law or of Viktor Orban or of Fidesz. I spoke to one member, one lawmaker of the EPP, who told me in typical Brussels double-speak, I quote, that the situation in Hungary is not an isolated problem, and that is why the European Parliament must stand for European values. Another MEP that was supportive of Fidesz and Mr. Orban was a Polish MEP from the Conservatives and Reformist group, who told me that George Soros is actually a problem for many countries, especially in Eastern Europe, as his financial support undermines the equality of chances for a fair debate. And he said, I quote, that it threatens traditional values by promoting the ideology of migration. Tessa?
All right, thank you for that. Brian Carter reporting there live from Brussels. Today is World Refugee Day. The UN's refugee agency says the number of people fleeing their homes remains at an all-time high, with 68.5 million displaced people worldwide. Well, that's an increase of 2.9 million people from last year. More than half of those displaced were under the age of 18, and the majority of those displaced come from Syria. And here in Europe, the refugee crisis has reignited political debate after the Aquarius, the ship carrying migrants rescued from Libyan waters, was blocked from entering Italy last week. And as we widely reported, the boat has finally docked in Spain, with French President Macron promising those who want to go to France will be permitted. And joining us now for more on World Refugee Day is William Spindler. He's the spokesperson for the UN Refugee Agency. Thank you for joining us today, William. Many people across Europe and the US feel that the refugee crisis is hitting these places disproportionately. But is this really the case?
No, it's not. We understand that there is a huge concern in Europe and other developed countries about immigration, but we really need to make a distinction between immigration and people who are fleeing their countries because of war and persecution. In other words, refugees, who are the vast majority of whom are in developing countries. 85%, in fact, of all refugees in the world are in developing countries, not in Europe and not in the developed world.
Yeah, and what countries are they fleeing to? So they're coming from the developing countries. Where are they going?
Well, 2/3 of all refugees in the world, in fact, come from only 5 countries. Syria, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Somalia, and South Sudan account for 2/3 of all refugees in the world, which means that if we could put an end to conflicts in these countries and people could return there, we could make a big dent in the number of refugees around the world.
And William, it's not just about numbers we're talking about. We're talking about people. And what are the conditions that these people are facing?
That's absolutely right. Today, on World Refugee Day, we want to remind the world that behind these statistics, there are people like you and me, people who have stories of loss and tragedy, but also of resilience, of survival, and people who are making a contribution to the societies where they are. People who are feeding their children, working, sending their children to schools, people who have dreams. And this is very important.
But, you know, there are a lot of voices also, as we've heard in Europe and the United States, where people are worried that there are too many refugees coming in. So is there an effective way of dealing with the refugee crisis and maintaining the security or insecurity that people feel in those countries where refugees are going?
We think that it's possible to have to control borders and to ensure security, while at the same time ensuring the rights of people to have access to protection and asylum. People who are fleeing war and persecution cannot return to the countries of origin. This is a very different situation from people who are simply trying to improve their living conditions, which is something that there's nothing wrong with that, but immigration has to be, economic immigration has to be legal. Whereas in the case of people who have no choice, they have to flee, they cannot return to the countries of origin, we need to find solutions. And there are examples of this. Yesterday, our High Commissioner for Refugees fled with over 120 refugees out to Niger to find solutions.
William, apologies, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you very much for joining us today on World Refugee Day. William Spindler, their spokesman for the UN Refugee Agency. Thanks. Well, Canada is the first G7 country to legalize the recreational use of cannabis. But here in Europe, the UK is having a cannabis debate of its own. Alex has more on this. Alex.
Tessa, Canada is just the second country in the world, and obviously the first in North America, to completely legalise the use of cannabis. That's news, obviously. We broke on Euronews. You can read the full article on our Twitter feed this morning if you want to go and have a little delve into that vote. But a really historic vote in Canada, which Justin Trudeau says will help protect children. And he says it's a promise kept, a political promise he made kept. He said it's been easy for kids to get hold of marijuana, and so now they're changing that to make sure that the profits do not go to criminals. And some people like Ashley here saying she's proud to be Canadian. This decision makes her proud to be Canadian. But there was resistance to the vote from Conservatives, many of whom say it won't make our kids safer. And they claim, like Denise Batters here, a senator, that actually it's been rushed through to try and meet the political deadline set by Justin Trudeau. Now, in Europe, the debate is subtly different. It is about medicinal marijuana, medicinal cannabis. And it's all been brought to a head by the case of Billy Caldwell here, a 12-year-old in Britain who was initially denied medicinal marijuana products in the UK because of the strict laws. The Home Secretary has intervened, allowing Billy to have those drugs, and now saying the UK will review its laws on medicinal marijuana, but it will not go as far as Canada. There's no suggestion at all the UK will allow the recreational use of cannabis. So, debates all around the world about cannabis. What are your thoughts? You can let us know using #theCube.
All right, thanks for that, Alex. And still to come for you on Good Morning Europe, here's a lesson, what not to call the French president. But first, let's look at your weather. You're watching Good Morning Europe. Welcome back. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron has got France talking after he scolded a cheeky teenager. Tell us all about that, Alex.
It was a World War II commemoration event, and the French president really was not happy with this schoolboy calling him by his nickname. Check this out.
Tu peux faire l'imbécile, mais aujourd'hui c'est la Marseillaise et le chant des partisans. Tu m'appelles Monsieur le Président de la République ou Monsieur. D'accord? Voilà, c'est bien. Et tu fais les choses dans le bon ordre. Si le jour où tu veux faire la révolution, tu apprends d'abord à avoir un diplôme et à te nourrir toi-même. D'accord? Et à ce moment-là, tu iras donner le son.
So the French president there, called by his nickname Manu by one of these teenagers. The French president himself then shared that account. This is what helped this incident go viral, saying respect is the minimum, especially on a day like that. So telling the teenager to call him Mr. President. Some people seeing this as a wonderful example of the president standing up for himself and French values. Other people, however, saying, actually, our president's just publicly scolded a schoolboy. We're not so comfortable with that. What do you think? Let us know using #theCube.
All right, thanks for that, Alex. And thank you for joining us in Good Morning Europe. Stay with your news throughout the day. In the meantime, today's No Comment is from Russia as fans celebrate the World Cup.
Супер, спасибо.